So picture this. It's December 1945,
Okay.
right? And there's this Egyptian farmer. His
Wow.
name is Muhammad Ali Saman, and he's out digging for fertilizer near a town called Nag Hammadi.
Just doing his normal daily routine.
Exactly, just digging. And suddenly, his mattock strikes something hard in the dirt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he uncovers this massive, sealed, red earthenware jar. It's like almost a meter tall.
Which is huge.
Right. Now, if you are a farmer in 1940s Egypt, and you just dug up a giant sealed ancient jar in the middle of the desert, you were probably terrified to open it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, local folklore at the time was pretty clear about that sort of thing.
Right. They believed these jars contained jinn,
Yeah. Spirits.
spirits that would, completely curse you the absolute second that seal was broken.
But he opens it anyway.
He does.
Yeah.
Because, greed kind of wins out over fear in these situations. He's thinking, maybe it's full of gold.
Sure, who wouldn't?
So he takes his mattock and he just smashes the jar. But there's no gold. Instead, this huge cloud of gold and papyrus dust just plumes up into the air.
A totally different kind of treasure, really.
Exactly. What he actually found inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus books.
The Nag Hammadi codices?
Yeah. And here is the craziest part of all of this. For like 1,500 years, the Orthodox Christian Church honestly thought they had successfully erased these exact books from human memory.
They thought the job was done.
Right. I mean, they'd burned the copies, they exiled the teachers, they officially declared these ideas dead and gone.
But they were very wrong.
So wrong. But, the real shock here, as we're going to see today, wasn't just what was written inside those ancient texts.
No, it's the motive.
Right. The real shock is why the early church felt they had to bury them in the first place, just to survive.
Yeah, I mean, that moment in 1945, it is the ultimate disruption of the historical record.
It totally changes everything.
It really does. Because, we like to think of history as this clean archaeological dig, right?
Like brushing sand off a perfect skeleton.
Exactly. You find a ruin, you carbon date it, and you draw a nice, clean line on a timeline where one era ends and another begins.
Simple.
But when you introduce the element of deliberate suppression...
When people are actually hiding things.
Right. When ideas are actively hunted down and buried, that clean historical X-ray machine just completely shatters.
You can't trust the timeline anymore.
No, you're left trying to diagnose muddy waters. Because an idea, especially a structurally dangerous idea, it doesn't just evaporate when you shove a manuscript into a jar and bury it under the Egyptian sand.
Right. It doesn't just die.
No, it mutates.
And that mutation, that is the core fascination of today's deep dive. So, welcome everyone. If you are listening to this right now, you have probably heard the term Gnostic Gospels at some point.
Or seen those late-night documentaries about, secret texts.
Oh, yeah, the really dramatic ones. But today, we are putting all of that Hollywood stuff completely aside.
Good, because it gets in the way.
It really does. Our entire exploration today is grounded in a monumental piece of scholarship. It's called the Nag Hammadi Library, Volume 4, Chapters 82 to 87 by Tony Eustein.
Which is just a fantastic, incredibly detailed resource.
It's amazing. This material offers a complete, rigorous, metaphysical and historical analysis of the afterlife of these texts, their modern rediscovery, and the genuine threat they actually pose to the early Christian world.
Right. And I think the mission here for us today is to totally dismantle that hype you mentioned.
Because it's not a movie.
Exactly. There are no cartoon villains in this story. We aren't dealing with some dark cabal of evil bishops twisting their mustaches in smoky back rooms.
Right.
And on the flip side, we aren't dealing with pure, flawless mystics who are just, too good and innocent for this cruel world.
Which is how they're usually portrayed, honestly.
It is, but it's completely inaccurate. We are going to look at the mechanical, structural reality of history. Like, how did these radical ideas actually survive in monastic disguises?
That's a huge question.
And why did those 19th century romantics project their own wild fantasies onto just, tiny missing fragments?
Yeah.
Why were these texts legitimately terrifying to a fragile early church? And perhaps most importantly, how is the decision to exclude them driven by this desperate, tragic need to keep a persecuted community from just dissolving into total chaos?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because I want to jump straight into the deepest part of the mystery.
Let's do it.
Let's talk about the Middle Ages. We are talking about a period stretching roughly 1,000 years where these Nag Hammadi codices are just sitting in the dark in Egypt.
Nobody knows they exist.
Right? Nobody in medieval Europe is sitting around reading the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Truth. They physically do not have access to them.
They're completely lost to the public.
And yet the core radical themes of those exact texts kept bubbling up in the writings of medieval monks and mystics.
It's fascinating.
It's wild.
Yeah.
I really need to understand the mechanics of that, because was there some sort of secret underground society passing these ideas along in whispers?
Yeah, we have to immediately discard that idea.
So no secret monks and hoods.
No secret hoods. Scholars call that the simple continuity model, and we just have to throw it out. There was no Da Vinci Code-style underground cable passing illicit books from late antiquity directly into the hands of, like, a 12th century monk in France.
So that's just a modern fiction.
Deeply modern fiction. The physical texts were gone. The specific mythological names, like Yaldabaoth, the ignorant creator, or Barbello, the divine mother, those names were gone.
Right.
But the refusal of a direct physical lineage doesn't mean the underlying conceptual pressure disappeared.
Okay, I love that. It's kind of like damming a massive river.
Oh, right. That's a great way to look at it.
You build this towering concrete wall, which in this case is the Orthodox canon, the finalized Bible, the whole institutional church structure.
The orthodoxy, yeah.
And you successfully stop the main visible flow of these alternative mythologies.
Yeah.
But the water itself, the sheer hydraulic pressure of those ideas, it doesn't just cease to exist.
It has to go somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It finds new microscopic paths. It seeps through the porous rock of the canyon. It travels underground and bubbles up a mile away, looking like a completely different spring.
That hydraulic pressure is exactly what we're talking about here. And the specific water that was dammed up was this relentless pressure toward interiority.
Interiority, meaning like looking inward.
Exactly. The early church successfully suppressed the wild, sprawling cosmologies. They got rid of the stories about multiple heavens and rogue angels.
The weird sci-fi stuff.
Right, the sci-fi stuff was gone. But they ended up absorbing the core psychological stance of those texts.
Which was what?
The idea that true religious seriousness requires a profound inward awakening.
Okay, right. But I'm kind of struggling with this whole containment idea.
How so?
Well, if I'm a medieval bishop, right, and I know that looking inward too much can lead to people questioning the church, why let any of this mystical stuff survive at all? If I'm the guy building the dam, why leave any cracks? Why not just ban all mysticism outright and say, God is outside of you, listen to the priest, and that is the end of the story?
Because you can't build a religion purely on administrative obedience. It just doesn't work.
People need more than a rule book.
Exactly. The church needed the fervor, the passion, and the genuine spiritual transformation that interiority provides. They didn't hate the inner life at all.
Oh, okay.
What they feared was unregulated inner life.
Unregulated.
That is the crucial distinction. The inner life was absolutely allowed, but it was assigned a very specific institutional job.
Okay, so what kind of job are we talking about?
It was put to work to refine prayer, to encourage repentance, to produce tears of contrition.
So it was channeled into making you a better, more compliant monk.
Essentially, yes. If you read a text from the actual Nag Hammadi Library, like the Gospel of Truth, human ignorance in that text isn't just some minor intellectual mistake.
Right.
It is a world-structuring fog. Salvation is described literally as waking up from a nightmare. The text says that when you wake up, all the terrors of the dream just vanish because they were never real to begin with.
That is such a beautiful, deeply internal realization.
It really is. And the thing is, medieval writers inherited this exact grammar of illumination and waking up.
Wait, really? Even without the text?
Even without the texts, monks in their cold stone cells wrote endlessly about the soul waking from the sleep of the material world.
That's the water seeping through the dam.
Exactly. But here is the mechanism of containment. The medieval church tethered that awakening to strict obedience.
So they put a leash on it.
A very tight leash. A mystic could have a blinding experience of divine light in their cell, but the moment they stepped out into the hallway, they were surrounded by confessors, monastic rules, and sacramental discipline.
Right, there were checks and balances everywhere.
Precisely. The inner light was never, ever allowed to become a tribunal that judged the outward authority of the church.
Ah, I see. So you can look inward to realize you are a flawed sinner in need of God's grace.
Yes.
But you absolutely cannot look inward, experience a flash of divine light, and conclude that the bishop is just an unnecessary middleman.
Exactly. That is the line you do not cross. Mysticism was rendered basically institutionally survivable.
It was safe.
Right. Let's contrast this with an actual Nag Hammadi text, like the Testimony of Truth.
Okay.
In that text, the inward recognition of the divine is the ultimate final criterion of truth, period.
So no rules apply.
Right. And the author actively mocks outward orthodox rituals. Like, he criticizes people who think water baptism actually saves them.
Oh, well, that's pretty direct.
Very direct. He also mocks people who rush toward martyrdom because they think a bloody death is a guaranteed ticket to heaven.
So he's directly attacking the institutional practices.
Exactly. The medieval church took the intensity of that inward focus, but they entirely stripped away its insurgent critical capacity.
They domesticated it.
They really did.
They took the wild wolf and turned it into a very loyal guard dog for the monastery.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the primary tool for this domestication, according to the source material, was allegory, right?
Yes, allegory was the ultimate containment vessel.
How so?
Well, think about the really foundational early church fathers, like Origen or Augustine.
Right, the heavy hitters.
Exactly. These guys were brilliant intellectuals. They knew that if you just read the Bible literally, it was often super confusing or even morally problematic.
Right, there's some pretty intense stuff in the Old Testament.
Definitely. So they championed this idea that Scripture had hidden spiritual depths beneath the surface text.
Okay.
Allegory is the method they use to find those hidden meanings.
But wait, didn't searching for hidden meanings open the door right back up for all those radical ideas the church was trying to bury in the first place?
You would think so, right? It would have if it weren't strictly supervised.
Oh, supervised allegory.
Yes. Allegory allowed a reader to explore the depths of Scripture, but, and this is the absolute genius of the Orthodox strategy, those depths were pre-mapped.
Pre-mapped, meaning they told you what you were allowed to find before you even went looking.
Exactly. Augustine used allegory to find these profound psychological truths about the soul's journey to God.
Which is fine, that's safe.
Right. But he never, ever used allegory to claim that the creator God of the Old Testament was actually a blind, ignorant, lower power who deliberately trapped humanity in physical bodies.
Which is exactly the hidden meaning that texts like the hypostasis of the archons pulled out of the Genesis story.
Exactly.
Because in that text, the serpent in the garden isn't the bad guy at all.
Not at all.
The serpent is actually a messenger of light trying to help Adam and Eve wake up. And the creator God who tells them not to eat from the tree of knowledge, he's actually a jealous, arrogant tyrant trying to keep them blind.
Precisely. The Nag Hammadi authors read Genesis and performed a complete 180-degree metaphysical reversal.
They flipped the script entirely.
They did, but medieval allegory disciplined the imagination, so that kind of reversal was completely impossible.
You could go deep, but you couldn't go rogue.
Right. You could find moral depths, you could find prophecies of Christ hidden in the text, but your thoughts were always routed through very stable interpretive boundaries.
The hidden meaning was administered by the institution.
Beautifully said, yes.
Okay, so the pressure toward deep, hidden wisdom survived, but the radical cosmologies were successfully blocked.
For a time, yes.
Okay, so for 1,000 years, these ideas just survive as ghosts in the monastery. Tamed, regulated, put to work.
Doing exactly what the church wanted.
But then history shifts. We hit the Renaissance, we hit the Enlightenment, and suddenly we arrive in the modern era. Specifically, the 19th and early 20th centuries.
The Romantic era.
Right, and this is so vital for you, the listener, to keep in mind. We are now in an era before the Nag Hammadi Library was discovered.
The jars are still in the ground.
Exactly. It's like 1850, nobody has the original texts, all they have are scraps.
Tiny fragments. They have highly biased summaries written by the early church fathers who actively hated these groups.
Like Irenaeus.
Yes, Irenaeus wrote this massive book called Against Heresies. And it is essentially just a catalog of his enemies.
It's basically a giant negative Yelp review of the Gnostics.
That's exactly what it is. And they had maybe one or two incredibly dense, bewildering texts that had been brought to Europe much later, like the Pistis Sophia.
But that's it.
That's it.
So if you're listening, imagine you are a 19th century romantic poet or maybe a Victorian occultist.
Right, you're sitting in London.
You are living through the Industrial Revolution. Factories are darkening the skies with smog. The traditional church feels rigid and bureaucratic.
It feels lifeless.
And you are desperate for some kind of authentic, ancient, mystical rebellion, but you don't have the actual books of these ancient heretics.
You just have the angry reviews written by the Orthodox bishops who crushed them.
Right. So what are you going to do? You are going to take those scraps and invent the movie you want to see.
Yes, this is a psychological phenomenon that Tony Eustine's analysis perfectly captures. He calls it mythologizing absence.
Mythologizing absence. I love that term.
It's brilliant. When evidence is scarce, it trains the human imagination to just fill in the gaps with its own desires.
We project what we want onto the blank spaces.
Completely. Because these modern readers didn't have the actual library to anchor them, to show them how difficult and weird the original texts actually were, they built an entire usable fantasy of Gnosticism.
They turned an incredibly complex ancient cosmology into a mirror for their own modern angst.
They absolutely did. They lived in an era of intense disenchantment. So they projected their desire for an anti-authoritarian, deeply personal spirituality backward onto the ancient world.
That made them look like modern rebels.
Right. They turned these highly diverse, late antique religious movements into a monolith, just a generalized symbol of the religion of the self.
Okay, let's talk about how they flattened the actual mythology to make this happen, because this is fascinating. Let's take the figure of Sophia.
Oh, Sophia's the perfect example.
If I hear the name Sophia today, in like a modern New Age context, she is usually framed as this tragic, divine, feminine heroine.
Right, a goddess of wisdom.
Yeah, who rebelled against the patriarchy. How does that compare to the actual ancient texts we found in Nag Hammadi?
It is a massive distortion.
Really?
Oh, totally. In the dense cosmological texts we eventually dug up, Sophia is not a modern psychological symbol of the estranged feminine.
What is she then?
She is a highly specific, technical, cosmological function.
That sounds like math.
It basically is.
Mm.
She represents a stage in this massive metaphysical architecture where the divine fullness attempts to comprehend itself and inadvertently causes a rupture in reality.
Wow, okay. That's dense.
Very dense. Her story is about the mechanics of how a perfect, unified spiritual realm generates derivative, flawed physical matter. It is almost mathematical in its complexity.
But the 19th century romantics didn't want math.
No. They stripped away all of that late antique cosmology and turned her into a romantic protagonist.
It's like taking a complex equation from a quantum physics textbook and turning it into a passionate poem about bad breakup.
Yep.
You're using the vocabulary, but you're entirely ignoring the math. And they did the exact same thing with the concept of the demiurge, didn't they?
They absolutely did.
Tell us about the demiurge.
Well, in Platonic and Gnostic thought, the demiurge is an answer to a very profound philosophical problem.
Which is?
How can a perfect, infinite, purely spiritual God interact with gross, changing physical matter without being corrupted by it?
Right. How do you bridge that gap?
The answer was a middleman, a derivative power, the demiurge, who actually shapes the material world. It was a highly sophisticated theory of distance and emanation.
But the 19th century occultists didn't care about the philosophy of derivative power, did they?
Not even a little bit.
They just wanted a bad guy.
Exactly. In the pre-1945 Romantic revival, the demiurge gets entirely flattened. He just becomes a generic symbol for whatever the Romantic writer happened to hate at the time.
Oh, so he's just a blank slate for their anger.
Right. The demiurge became the oppressive government, or the strict Victorian church, or just the stifling human ego. Entire metaphysical structures were translated into modern emotional and political dramas.
And the cognitive consequence of this is what you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Romanticizing absence.
Yes.
Because they didn't know the reality. They just assumed these suppressed groups must have been perfectly pure freedom fighters.
It's the enemy of my enemy is my friend logic.
Right. If the giant bureaucratic Catholic Church hated these guys in the 2nd century, they must have been these glorious, free-thinking pioneers of liberty.
Which completely ignores the reality of what happened when we finally dug up the texts in 1945.
Yeah, what happened when they finally read them?
When scholars finally sat down to read texts like Zostrianos or Allogenes, they were shocked.
Why?
Because these were not democratic manifestos of free love and interior freedom.
What were they?
They are incredibly dense, technically demanding, highly structured accounts of visionary ascent.
Meaning what? Like a step-by-step guide?
Yeah, kind of. When you crack open Zostrianos, you aren't reading a simple, comforting parable. You're reading a dizzying, multi-layered itinerary of a visionary ascending through specific, named realms.
They call them the eons, right?
Right, the eons. And each realm requires a precise metaphysical password.
Like a video game level.
Actually, yes. And it requires immense ascetic discipline, fasting, and intense intellectual labor. It reads way more like an advanced metaphysical operations manual than a warm, fuzzy spiritual guide.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't for everybody.
Not at all. They were fiercely elitist in their intellectual demands.
Okay, so the modern seekers loved the idea of the texts. They loved the aesthetic of the suppressed rebel.
It looked great on paper.
But when we actually blow the dust off the papyrus, we find out that these texts were deeply dangerous to the early church. Just not because they were writing romantic poetry about the divine feminine.
Right. They were dangerous because they proposed a completely alternative structural blueprint for reality itself.
And this brings us to the core threat, the real reason they were buried. And it all starts with how these texts diagnose the fundamental human problem, doesn't it?
Yes, the diagnosis is everything.
Okay, let's slow down and really map this out for the listener. Because if you ask a standard Orthodox Christian in the 2nd or 3rd century, or even today, really what the core problem of humanity is, the answer is sin.
Yes, moral failure.
Adam and Eve disobeyed, the relationship with God was broken, and humanity inherited this guilt.
And if the problem is sin and guilt, the required solution is forgiveness and redemption.
Which makes sense.
And crucially, that redemption is mediated through a historical event, the crucifixion of Jesus, and administered over time through the Church's sacraments.
Like baptism and communion.
Exactly. The institution holds the medicine for the disease of sin.
Okay, but if I'm reading the Apocryphon of John or the Gospel of Truth, how is the disease diagnosed there?
The disease is not moral failure.
It's not sin.
No. The disease is ignorance. It is a cosmic amnesia.
Amnesia.
Yes. You haven't committed a crime against the Creator. You have simply forgotten that you belong to a realm vastly superior to the Creator.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, salvation cannot be a legal pardon administered by a bishop. A bishop splashing water on you doesn't cure amnesia.
Right. If I forgot who I am, a pardon doesn't help me.
Exactly.
So what cures amnesia?
An event of recognition, an awakening. You need a catalyst, a teacher, a flash of insight that shocks you into remembering your divine origin.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if the problem is just that I'm asleep and salvation is just me waking up to my divine spark,
Yeah.
that makes the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy functionally obsolete.
Bingo.
I mean, if I can just wake up through insight, why do I need to tithe to the bishop? Why do I need the priest to bless the bread?
You don't.
But surely waking up just means being a good, enlightened person. Does this mean these groups just wanted total chaos and no ethical rules?
This is where we have to connect the theology to the sociology.
Yeah.
Because no, they did not want chaos. Many of these groups lived incredibly rigorous, disciplined lives. But what they wanted was something that structurally terrified the early bishops.
What was it?
They wanted ethics without enforcement.
Ethics without enforcement. Now that sounds like a total contradiction in terms to a Roman governor or to an early bishop trying to herd 1,000 scared converts.
It really does.
How does that actually work in practice?
Let's look at the Orthodox model first. The early church had a text called the Didache.
Right, the teaching manual.
Exactly. It was a highly practical community manual. It is brilliant in its clarity. It outlines the way of life and the way of death.
Very black and white.
Very. It tells you exactly how to baptize, exactly how many days to fast, and even how to test if a visiting prophet is a fraud.
Oh, practical.
Yes. It provides strict, teachable rules and visible boundaries. You can easily enforce the Didache. You can literally look at a member of the congregation and say, you didn't fast on Wednesday, you broke the rule.
It's observable. It is an administrative baseline.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with a Nag Hammadi text like the Teachings of Sylvanus or the Gospel of Philip.
Okay.
These texts are highly ethical, but they do not provide a checklist of enforceable rules.
What do they do instead?
Their exhortations target the mind, the intellect, and human desire. They seek a rational and spiritual reorientation.
So it's an inside job.
Right. They believe that if you truly wake up to the reality of the divine cosmos, right action will flow naturally from that profound insight.
Oh, I see.
You will live purely, not because you fear a punitive church tribunal or the flames of hell, but because you see the material world for the illusion it actually is.
So you act ethically because you finally understand the physics of the universe, not because you're terrified the bishop is going to excommunicate you.
Yes, and while that is philosophically beautiful, it severely weakens the emotional leverage of the institution.
I can see that.
Throughout human history, fear has been a highly effective instrument of social cohesion.
Right. Fear of judgment, fear of impurity.
Fear of postmortem punishment. These things keep communities stabilized, especially under pressure.
So taking that away is dangerous.
Very. When the gospel of truth declares that fear is just a byproduct of the fog of error, and that attaining the truth completely evaporates fear, it is actively pulling the teeth of institutional enforcement.
If your congregation isn't afraid of you or of hell, how do you govern them?
You can't. Not easily, anyway.
And it goes even deeper than individual ethics, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because these texts don't just say you don't need the bishop, they actually expose the power structures themselves as fraudulent.
Yes, they provide a devastating political critique wrapped in mythological language.
Tell me about that.
This is where the cosmology of the archons comes into play. Let's look at the hypostasis of the archons again.
Okay.
In this text, the rulers of this material world, the archons, led by that blind creator Yaldabaoth, they are not just described as morally evil.
Right.
They are diagnosed as ignorant and derivative.
Derivative, meaning they aren't the true source of power.
Right. They are cosmic middle managers.
I love that. Middle managers.
They sit in their bureaucratic heavens, managing the physical universe, and they arrogantly declare, "I am God and there is no other."
But they're wrong.
They are completely wrong. The text reveals that they only have power because they accidentally stole a spark of light from the higher, true divine realm. They think they are the CEO, but they are utterly blind to the massive spiritual reality existing far above them.
My mind is honestly blown right now. Think about the implications of that for a second-century Christian.
It's massive.
You are living in the Roman Empire. You see the emperor demanding worship. You see the local Roman magistrates executing people in the streets.
Every day.
And you see your own local bishop consolidating power, setting up rigid hierarchies of deacons and priests.
Yep.
If you read the hypostasis of the archons, you don't just look at the emperor or the bishop as a guy who might be a bit corrupt. You look at the very concept of hierarchy and domination as a symptom of cosmic ignorance.
It strips the innocence entirely out of hierarchy.
It really does.
It means that a functioning order cannot claim to be automatically true or divinely ordained just because it functions.
Wow.
A system can be highly organized, incredibly efficient, capable of building roads and collecting taxes and enforcing creeds, and yet be completely detached from divine reality.
That is a politically and ecclesiologically devastating critique.
It is. The myth of the blind archons provided a diagnostic grammar for understanding exactly how domination works through administration and blindness.
So let's put ourselves in the sandals of a second-century bishop for a second.
Okay.
Let's say I'm Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon. My predecessor, Pothinus, was just brutally tortured and martyred by the Romans in the arena.
A horrific historical reality.
Right, so my community is terrified. We are a fragile, illegal, persecuted minority. I need absolute unity to keep my people from falling apart.
You are in survival mode.
Pure survival mode. And suddenly I find out that circulating in my congregation is a text telling my flock that their fundamental problem is ignorance, not sin. It tells them salvation is an inward awakening, so they don't need my sacraments. It tells them not to fear my disciplinary rules.
It's undoing everything you built.
And to top it all off, it strongly implies that my very office as bishop might just be a reflection of a blind, arrogant cosmic manager.
Right. If you are Irenaeus, you don't look at that text as a beautiful piece of diverse poetry.
No way.
You look at it as an existential threat to the survival of your community. It is a highly contagious conceptual virus that dissolves the glue holding your people together under extreme duress.
Which perfectly leads us to the fourth major phase of our deep dive.
How and why they were buried.
Exactly. Because if there's one thing I really want you, the listener, to take away from this, it's that the men who suppressed these texts were not comic book villains.
This is one of the most vital corrections Tony Eustein's analysis makes. The suppression of the Nag Hammadi texts was not driven by cackling malice or some secret conspiracy to hide the real truth from humanity.
Right. It wasn't a Dan Brown novel.
No. It was driven by structural incentives. It was about order as a survival strategy. We really have to look at the logistical reality of late antique Christianity.
What was the reality on the ground?
The church was attempting to scale up across continents, across diverse languages from Syriac to Latin to Greek, and all while under hostile imperial conditions.
It is exactly like scaling a startup company.
Okay, I like this. Go on.
If you have a group of 5 brilliant founders in a garage, you can operate on deep, intuitive, abstract alignment.
Sure, you all just vibe.
Right. You don't need a massive rulebook. Everyone just gets it. But what happens when you scale to 50,000 employees globally?
You can't rely on vibes anymore.
You absolutely cannot run a global enterprise on complex, highly localized, abstract poetry. You need an operations manual. You need human resources. You need standard operating procedures.
Yes.
The Apocryphon of John is a brilliant, dizzying metaphysical puzzle, but as an operations manual for a massive global church, it is utterly useless.
It is completely non-functional for that purpose. What the emerging Orthodox Church needed was what scholars call liturgical usability and doctrinal predictability.
Liturgical usability, meaning it's easy to use in church.
Yes, they needed texts that could be easily taught to illiterate catechumens. They needed narratives that could be summarized in a simple creed.
Right.
They needed letters that could be read aloud in a house church in Rome, copied, sent to Alexandria, and understood in roughly the exact same way.
So texts like the Gospel of Luke or Paul's letter to the Romans.
Exactly. Those are highly usable. They provide clear, linear historical narratives and explicit communal instructions.
But a text from Nag Hammadi like Trimorphic Protanoia.
Oh, Trimorphic Protanoia is a thunderous, mystical poem about the descent of the divine voice.
Sounds amazing, but
it requires intense specialist mediation to even begin to comprehend. It demands an entire contemplative ecology, a lifestyle of deep philosophical asceticism. It is not predictable.
it doesn't scale.
It doesn't scale at all. Even texts that seem simpler, like the famous Gospel of Thomas, posed a massive logistical problem.
Wait, really? Why? I mean, the Gospel of Thomas is just a list of 114 sayings of Jesus. There's no complex mythology in it. Why was that a threat?
Because it is a collection of open-ended, cryptic wisdom sayings with zero narrative scaffolding.
Oh.
It inherently generates multiple competing interpretations. The text explicitly tells the reader to seek the interpretation of the sayings themselves.
Let him who seeks continue seeking.
Yes, and that leads to the ultimate nightmare for early church administrators: the fear of fragmentation.
Because if every visionary in the congregation can claim ultimate truth based on their own personal interpretation,
Or their own inward awakening.
right, then the community dissolves into 100 competing factions. There is no baseline.
Right. Irenaeus and Tertullian were terrified of this centrifugal force.
They saw it happening.
They watched communities splinter in real time. They saw brilliant teachers like Valentinus gather massive followings, creating essentially a church within a church.
A schism.
Yes. To the Orthodox Fathers, establishing a boundary wasn't just an aesthetic preference. It was the absolute only way to stop the bleeding.
Wow.
If you don't have a visible mechanism of unity like the recognized office of the bishop, a standardized rule of faith, and an agreed-upon canon of Scripture, Christianity flies apart into 1,000 competing revelation claims and eventually just vanishes from history.
And when you're under threat from the outside, from the Romans, you absolutely crave moral certainty on the inside.
Exactly. Moral certainty functions as an immunological defense.
I love that.
When a community is facing physical persecution, they need to know that their sacrifices, their strict boundaries, and their suffering are built on solid rock.
Right.
Imagine you are preparing your congregation for the very real possibility of martyrdom tomorrow. You need them to implicitly trust the Creator.
Of course.
Exposing them to texts that claim the Creator God is actually a blind, ignorant ruler.
That would ruin everything.
Or texts like the second treatise of the Great Seth, which claims the physical suffering of Jesus on the cross was just an illusion, and he was actually laughing above the cross.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that shatters defensive certainty completely.
It reopens settled questions. For an institution trying to survive a siege, reopening foundational questions feels like a deep betrayal of the flock.
I see the bind they were in. And this raises an incredibly difficult question about the nature of history itself.
It raises the problem of what we might call the tragedy of consolidation.
The tragedy of consolidation, what does that mean?
Well, to call this historical process a tragedy is not to say the early church was evil for doing it.
Right.
It's to acknowledge that historical goods are almost always purchased with historical costs.
The trade-off.
Yes. The early Orthodox Church achieved unity. They achieved survivability, they developed a common language, and preserved a tradition that profoundly shaped the entire world.
They survived.
But the cost of that survival was the deliberate amputation of a massive, vibrant part of its own metaphysical imagination.
Man, it was a tragic necessity.
It really was.
Good intentions, like pastoral care, the desire for unity, the instinct to protect the vulnerable from philosophical confusion, all those good intentions resulted in the permanent loss of profound spiritual possibilities.
Exact.
The bishops didn't suppress these texts because they hated the truth. They suppressed them because they loved their people and were terrified they would scatter and be destroyed.
That is a crucial distinction. Malice burns hot and fades quickly. But conviction institutionalizes.
Wow.
The bishops excluded these alternative texts because they sincerely, deeply believed that eternal souls were at stake.
But because that exclusion was built on such solid good intentions, it normalized the loss.
So thoroughly that centuries later, Christianity entirely forgot that these were even losses. They just became the heresies we successfully avoided.
Which fundamentally changed how humanity remembers its own spiritual history. The X-ray machine was broken, and we forgot it was ever whole.
Beautifully put.
And that brings us to the final, lingering challenge of our deep dive today. How do we actually handle these texts today?
Because the game has changed.
It has. The jars were opened in 1945. The texts have been translated. The seal is completely broken. And that forces us to confront the ethics of memory, forgetting, and revival.
To understand the stakes of this revival, we have to look at memory not just as a cognitive function, but as a political resource.
A political resource.
Yes. The source text draws a brilliant contrast between two types of memory. The Orthodox tradition operates primarily on commemorative memory.
Commemorative, like a memorial.
Right. This is the preservation of historical events through authorized, repeated public rehearsal.
Like the liturgy, do this in memory of me. It's public, it's shared, it's scheduled, and crucially, is managed by a priest.
Exactly. Commemorative memory builds and sustains institutions because it relies entirely on collective repetition.
Okay, and what about the other kind?
The Nag Hammadi texts often operate on what we call restorative memory.
Restored.
Yes. This isn't about remembering a past historical event, like a crucifixion in first century Jerusalem. It's about waking up to your own forgotten, pre-existent divine origin.
Right, curing the amnesia we talked about.
The gospel of truth is entirely built around this concept. Forgetting is the fog of error that traps you in the material world. Memory is the realization of who you truly are, a spark of the divine fullness.
And this kind of memory inherently undoes institutions because it doesn't require a priest to authorize it. It happens spontaneously within the subject.
Precisely. So by ensuring that the restorative texts were forgotten by burying them, refusing to copy them, or burning them, the church stabilized its own reality.
So forgetting wasn't an accident of history.
Not at all.
It was an active, necessary stabilizer for the Orthodox worldview. It removed the conceptual competition entirely.
Yes. Forgetting stabilizes the conceptual field by converting a chaotic plurality into a manageable silence.
A manageable silence.
Once those radical texts were gone, the surviving Orthodox framework appeared totally self-evident. It just looked like the way things have always been.
But now the silence is shattered.
Wide open.
We have the texts back. You can go online right now, today, and buy the Nag Hammadi Library in paperback on Amazon.
You absolutely can.
And you see people today who absolutely love this stuff. They take words like gnosis or archon or demiurge, and they put them on T-shirts.
Oh, I see it all the time.
They use them as self-help slogans on social media. Awaken your inner spark. Defeat the archons of corporate America.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
It makes me wonder, given the crisis of meaning in the modern world, can we just reclaim these texts? Can't we just dust off the Apocryphon of John and start a modern Gnostic church?
This is where we have to be extremely intellectually rigorous. We must clearly delineate between recovery and resurrection.
Okay, what is the difference between those two?
We recovered the physical artifacts, we dug up the papyrus codices, we utilized modern linguistics to translate the Coptic into English. That is a recovery of the archive. But we cannot resurrect the living traditions that actually produced them.
Why not?
A religious tradition is a living, continuous chain. It is a chain of master and disciple, of daily ritual, of communal discipline, of vocal inflection, and even inside jokes.
Right, the stuff that doesn't make it onto the page.
Exactly. That living chain was decisively broken for 1,500 years. We do not know their rituals. We do not know how they actually used the Apocryphon of John in a real pedagogical setting.
So we're just guessing.
We are. To claim that reading a paperback translation of the Gospel of Thomas in your living room makes you the direct, resurrected continuation of a second-century visionary community, is a historical fantasy.
It's arrogant.
It actively erases the tragic reality of the 1500-year rupture.
It's a form of what some scholars call spiritual consumerism.
It is the ultimate spiritual consumerism.
Wow.
Modern readers love to treat the Nag Hammadi Library like a spiritual buffet.
Just grab what you want and leave the rest.
Exactly. They cherry pick. They take the cool anti-authoritarian quotes from the Gospel of Thomas or the beautiful poetic language of the bridal chamber from the Gospel of Philip.
The stuff that sounds good on a podcast.
Right. But they completely ignore the dense, demanding, almost impenetrable cosmological math of Zostrianos.
They skip the hard parts.
They ignore the severe, world-denying, extreme fasting demanded by the testimony of truth.
So they want the prestige of the ancient rebellion without any of the actual grueling ascetic labor those texts demanded.
Exactly.
They want the inner divinity, but they want to leave behind the terrifying multi-layered cosmos and the strict disciplines.
And that is a profound failure of the ethics of revival.
It's intellectually dishonest.
It is intellectually dishonest to rip these texts out of their late antique context and use them as prestige capital or commercialized secret wisdom.
Yeah.
If you take the word archon, which in these texts is a highly specific cosmological function regarding derivative power, ignorance, and the shaping of matter, and you just use it as a bumper sticker slogan to mean my oppressive boss or the government, you are destroying the precision of the ancient text.
You're dumbing it down.
You are replacing rigorous conceptual labor with a cheap meme.
You're doing exactly what the 19th century romantics did.
Exactly the same thing.
You're just projecting your modern frustrations onto an ancient metaphysical system. You're refusing to let the text speak on its own weird alien terms.
Right. And by doing so, you are avoiding the actual demands the text makes of you. These texts do not flatter the modern reader.
No, they don't.
They demand intense, sustained interpretive labor. They require you to undergo a profound, disorienting reorientation of how you perceive reality itself.
It's not light reading.
Not at all. Treating them as modular, bite-sized self-help resources is a massive failure of responsibility to the archive. We have the texts back, and that means we have a responsibility to approach them with rigor, respect, and awe, not just romantic fantasy.
They deserve that respect.
They are difficult, brilliant, and demanding voices from the past, and they deserve to be read as they actually are, in all their strange complexity, not just as we wish them to be.
Let's pull all of this together, because the journey we've been on today completely shatters the simple narratives we're usually handed about these texts.
It really changes the whole picture.
We started by looking at how ideas behave like water under pressure, surviving as redirected whispers and mystical containment within medieval monastic cells.
Right.
We watched how modern seekers, starved for authentic rebellion, projected their own romantic desires onto the tiny scraps of myth they possessed.
Mythologizing absence.
Exactly. And then we dug deep into the architectural core of why these texts were so threatening.
The real danger.
Right, how their vision of unmediated knowledge of salvation as a sudden awakening rather than a managed pardon, and their exposure of the ignorance of hierarchy, all of that was structurally terrifying to an early church, trying desperately to hold itself together.
It was an existential threat.
And we realized that the suppression of these texts was a tragic byproduct of the church's need to survive under persecution, not a comic book conspiracy of evil men.
It was about survivability.
Right. And finally, we confronted the uncomfortable reality that while the Egyptian desert has given us back the ink of the papyrus, we cannot simply step back into the past.
The chain is broken.
We must treat these recovered texts with the intense ethical rigor they demand, resisting the modern urge to consume them as cheap spiritual commodities or empty slogans.
That's the real challenge for us today.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? It means that you can now approach these texts with clear eyes.
You know the context now.
You understand that the Nag Hammadi Library isn't just a collection of banned books full of spicy alternate history designed to sell thriller novels.
Definitely not.
They represent an entirely different architectural blueprint for human spirituality. They represent a road, not taken a road that prioritized inward recognition over external obedience and diagnosed the human condition as a tragic amnesia rather than a moral crime.
And that leaves us with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over.
What's that?
Well, we've spent this time seeing how the boundaries of what was considered normal, orthodox, and true for 15 centuries were largely shaped by the successful, well-intentioned forgetting of these alternative, radical ideas.
Right.
It forces you to look at our own time and ask, what radical, potentially world-changing truths are currently sitting just outside your field of vision today, simply because our current society hasn't yet figured out how to safely manage or monetize them?
Oh, wow.
What are we actively forgetting right now just to keep our own system stable?
Because that historical X-ray machine, it's still broken. It always will be. We're always peering through the murky, complex layers of what was kept, what was altered, and what was discarded in the desert.
Always.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Nag Hammadi archive. Keep questioning the architecture of the information you are given, keep looking for the water seeping through the dam, and we will see you next time.